The people are horrified because the political leader, that fox, Pilate, has done the most horrendous thing. He has waited until some Jewish Galileans were making their sacrifices of animals slain and their blood spilled in the Jewish temple, and he has gone in there and killed them and mixed the blood of the Galileans, the people, with the animals they have just sacrificed. It's a desecration on many levels. Murder in the temple, desecrating their own sacrifice to his Roman God. It's horrifying. And these people say to Jesus, look what's happened. And he responds in an interesting way that indicates how well he knows the people of the time. He says, do you think that those Galileans who died are worse sinners than the rest of the Galileans, meaning us standing around here? No. I tell you, unless you repent, you will perish just as they did. And then he brings in another example of a horrible misfortune, not a misfortune brought on by the evil of another person, but part of a tower, the Tower of Siloam, an area on the wall of Jerusalem, around the temple, has fallen on some people, and they have died. And he says, do you think that they were worse sinners than you because they had that misfortune? He says, no. I tell you, but unless you repent, you will perish just as they did. He's doing several things here. First of all, Jesus is challenging the common belief at the time that if misfortune happened to somebody, it's because they were a bad sinner. And the worse your sin, the worse the thing that happened to you. So you've got to be a really bad sinner if you were murdered in the temple by Pilate. And Jesus says, no, has nothing to do with that. Misfortune happens. Evil befalls people. Natural disasters befall people. Illness befalls people equally all over, the moral and the immoral. It just happens. But then he says twice, unless you repent, you will perish just as they did. Unless you repent, you will perish just as they did. And the Greek there is not die, physical death, it's perdition. The loss of life and the sense of total separation from God. Now, where's that nice, sweet Jesus that we all know so well? Why is he saying, unless you repent? These are people who are following Jesus around. Why is he being so pointed? And then, as if they haven't gotten that message, he goes on to tell them the parable of the fig tree that bears no fruit. Now, a lot of people like to do exact allegories when it comes to parables. Okay, the owner of the vineyard is God, and the gardener is Jesus, and we, the sinners, are the fig tree that's not bearing any fruit. And parables don't always have that neat one-to-one correspondence, but it's clearly a story about people who are hoping that something is going to turn around in that fig tree, that it's going to start being fruitful, it's going to start doing what is expected of it, if it is nurtured by that gardener. And then the gardener says, call it Jesus if you like, the gardener says, give it one more year, and if it doesn't bear fruit, then cut it down. Now, we're used to talking about the limitless, boundless mercy and grace and forgiveness of God. It's never ending. Now, there's a problem with that mindset, right? There can be a problem with focusing on that. What is the problem with that mindset? If I'm saved, and God's mercy and forgiveness is just boundless and flowing like the Niagara Falls, well, so I keep doing that thing I keep doing. So I keep judging those people over there. So those must be the worst sinners, and I'm not the such bad sinner. I'm over here with the people who didn't get crushed by the wall falling. Jesus is deeply concerned with the hypocrisy of religious people. And I know this because chapter 12 has a little label in study Bibles that says, Jesus warns against hypocrisy. So for all of chapter 12, he has said, don't be morally hypocritical. Why are you complaining about the splinter in someone's eye when there's a log in your own? Stop complaining about other people. Turn the gaze inward, not outward. So one, he's concerned about that moral hypocrisy. He is also concerned with the lack of humility in humankind in general, the lack of understanding of our place amongst one another, with one another, and our relationship with God. It can get lax, I speak from experience, it can get lax if we think we are close to God. I'll give you an example, and of course I'll use one from my life. My first year of seminary, there are 3 years of seminary. The first years are the freshmen, the middlers, and the seniors are the third years. And they get insufferably more obnoxious as they go through seminary. It's true, isn't it? I'm right. It's true. So there I was, my first year of seminary, and we're supposed to go to morning prayer every morning. And the dean had said to us, if you don't show up, I'm going to call you, and I'm going to say, hey, if you want to be a priest, why don't you go to church? Why don't you like church? So I was a pretty faithful attendee, and I liked morning prayer more normally. But around comes Lent, and we would sit in chapel just like this. This is exactly what we looked like, except there were about 70 of us, because my class was the biggest class that ever arrived at Berkeley Divinity School at Yale, and the rest of them hated us for it because we basically took over the chapel. So they were obnoxious. I didn't like the third years because they were so full of themselves. The second years were very cliquish, and my own class. I mean, there were 2 people I just couldn't stand, and then even my friends, they were getting on my nerves. So what I decided was, I'm not going to chapel this week. Like, I've had it. I've had it with these people. They're just so snooty, so full of themselves, so morally hypocritical. And I stayed home, and I was kind of liking it. It's just me and God and my little morning prayer. It's just me and my own BCP, my own Bible, really enjoying me and God. And also I took the time to read theology, because theology is all about God, and I loved theology. I just said, I hunger and I thirst for you, God, and I want to know all about you in my own private little apartment. And that went great for 3 days, and I did kind of wonder, I wonder when the dean's going to call, because I was such a goody two-shoes that he probably thought I was quite ill. Then on Thursday, I'm reading something about the mercy, the mercy and grace of God, and how limitless and how boundless it is. And suddenly, I finally get it. I finally get it. That I have been sitting in judgment of my entire 3 years of classmates, all of them. That I was being morally hypocritical. That I was judging them when I had been judging them for judging me. You don't cross the right way. You don't bow the right way. You don't even know what color it's supposed to be, and blah, 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 blah. And I started laughing. I just started laughing at the hypocrisy. The hypocrisy of saying, I'm not going to go to church because those people are so obnoxious. So I did repent. I just said, okay, I got the message, thank you. I don't need to read about you. I need to go be a Christian. So I went back to chapel, obviously. I sat across from them, and I prayed for all of my seminarians. I realized they had redeeming qualities, and who was I to sit in judgment of them, et cetera, et cetera. It was a funny little story. I've never forgotten it to this day, how I sat there for 4 days just feeling so great about myself in Lent. There are, of course, more serious stories, and we're going to hear the more serious story about the prodigal son and how he encounters the mercy and grace of God. The concern that Jesus has is how we take the relationship with God so lightly. That is why he tells the story about the fig tree. You're trying to get it to do something, you keep helping it. If it doesn't do anything, cut it down. And the reason he does that is that we would never treat one another that way. If your spouse kept forgiving you and forgiving you and forgiving you for coming in late or not taking care of the kids or quitting your job time after time, if they kept forgiving you over and over, and you never changed or you never forgave them, eventually they'd say, cut it down. Your friend, if you cancel on your friend Every time you have plans, how long do you think that's going to last? After a couple of years, they're going to say, I'm going to find another person. We wouldn't do that because we respect our interpersonal relationships enough not to teach our loved ones that way. When your spouse forgives you, you say thank you. When your child comes back to you, you say thank you, right? We respect our human relationships, but what he's concerned about is that we lose the humility in our relationship with God, because this is the perfect forgiver, the most merciful, the greatest. So God's never going to get so fed up with me that God's going to dump me. But that's the sign that we're not actually in a relationship with the actual living God. Because if we were in a relationship with the actual living God, we would never have that attitude. We would be living our lives in praise and gratitude all the time, and a kind of humility that says, I just want to sit at your feet, God, and receive anything you've got for me. Not, well, you're such a loving and great God that I know that I'll come around eventually and you'll be there for me. Do you see what I mean about how he doesn't want us to take God lightly? Why would we take God more lightly than our average human relationship? And so he reminds us, unless you repent, you will die. Because here's what happens when you say, eventually, God, I'll get around to you. Eventually. Say, eventually, God, eventually. Well, we just eventually move ourselves right out of our relationship with God. It's not God ending our life with God. It's us ending our life with God. We don't harm anybody except ourselves when we take God's grace lightly. Do you think it hurts God? God just goes on being godness, life eternal. It only harms us. And so Jesus uses these human terms, unless you do this, this is going to happen, to remind us, don't take God lightly. Next week, we're going to have more fun with the prodigal son. And we're going to hear more about that the God of the unending mercy and unending forgiveness. And we'll all have a part to play. So stay tuned.